Good morning, everyone. I think I know most all of you, but my name's Karlee. I did not attend MACU, but my dad did, so I'm very familiar. I'm here today to talk to you guys about something I'm very passionate about, and that's substance use. I currently work for the state of North Carolina in substance detox and stabilization, so we see all sorts of different diagnoses and walks of life. Today, I just want to highlight some statistics and some things you may not know, and then I want to talk about the role that I believe our church and our community should play in helping people who are trying to maintain recovery. That being said, I want to give a little bit of a background about me so you know that I know what I'm talking about. I have a master's degree in clinical counseling, and I am dually licensed as a clinical addiction specialist as well as a clinical counselor. I have about 4 years of experience in inpatient and outpatient settings, and I have worked with people from all over the country in hopes of helping them in their recovery. I currently attend Christ Church in Winterville, where I volunteer and do a lot there. At my place of work, our goal is to detox and stabilize our patients, and then we aim to provide them with education, tools, and resources in an attempt to prevent relapse and teach them how to maintain long-term recovery, which is very hard. If you're familiar with substance use, relapse is very, very common, unfortunately, and is unfortunately deemed just part of the recovery process. So my goal today is to provide some insight on substance use, some statistics you may not be aware of, and some things I would really like for y'all to keep in mind going forward. As I speak, if you have questions, I would love to answer them. And if I'm speaking too fast, I'm trying to slow down, just so you know. Get that from my dad, I guess. All right. So the first thing is just, what is substance use? What are substance use disorders? So many of you are probably familiar with the term addiction or substance abuse, right? We've heard that someone's addicted, that they're an addict, that they're abusing substances, probably for all of our lives, right? So these are terms that we now consider dated, and they often bring negative connotation to the mental health field. You know, calling someone an addict does not really paint them in the best of light, right? So we've moved away from that verbiage, and we now use substance use disorder. It is now used in the place of addiction in an attempt to reduce the stigma of substance use disorders and to provide a more medically accurate view of the condition. So the DSM defines a substance use disorder as a pattern of recurrent substance use that leads to significant impairment or distress, which is evidenced by meeting at least 2 of 11 diagnostic criteria within a year time period. In simple terms, a substance use disorder is a treatable but chronic disease characterized by continued substance use despite negative consequences. Does that make sense? Examples of these things include your substance use keeping you from attending social outings or work, your substance use negatively impacting your relationships with your loved ones or your friends, an increased tolerance, which means you would be using more substances over time, spending more money, putting your body in further distress. And then examples of risky use could include using previously used or dirty needles or stealing money or items from your loved ones or from businesses in order to fund your habit. Obviously, all of these things have negative impacts on your physical, mental, and overall well-being, right? Okay. So the most common myth that I think we hear, especially in churches, as someone who has grown up in church and currently attends, is that addiction is a choice, right? I'm sure some of you have heard that at some point, correct? Yeah, we're told, they just choose to keep using. It's their fault. They'll get out of it one day. It's a sin. They can pray it away, right? Unfortunately, that's just not true. And that has a lot of negative impact on the substance use community. Many people believe that substance use, or addiction, is a choice, and thus they choose not to have empathy on people who struggle. It's really sad to me. I deal with a lot of family members and a lot of loved ones who know that their family members are struggling. They know that they're homeless. They know that they have no options, but they choose to view it as a choice and thus not help them. And unfortunately, it's my patients, the substance use community, that suffers from that. The truth is that substance use is a medical disorder and not a moral failing. That's something I try to remind people of all the time. No one chose to become addicted to a substance. No one picks up a glass of wine or a prescription pill or a cigarette thinking that it will spiral into something that they become enslaved to. No one chooses to feel powerless over their life. In order to help aid individuals in our churches and our communities, we have to have this mindset. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is that substance abuse does not just mean illegal substances. There are many legal substances that are just as likely to be problematic in our communities. Things like alcohol, prescription pain medications, and nicotine are misused as much, if not more, than illegal substances such as meth, fentanyl, and cocaine. Any substance with mind-altering effects has the likelihood to be misused and habit-forming. I think this is important to remember when we think about our youth and our children and young adults in our communities and churches and the prevalence of things like vapes and underage drinking. It's never too early to start having these conversations with your children, with your youth groups, with your grandchildren, whomever it may be. They need to know sooner than later. That being said, alcohol is the leading cause of preventable death in the U.S. every year. Alcohol is something you can buy at Food Lion, at your local Mexican restaurant, at Walmart, anywhere you go, you can pretty much buy alcohol. According to data from the CDC, there are approximately 488 deaths each day from excessive alcohol use. I don't know about y'all, but I don't see 488 people every day. So to think that 488 people are dying from one substance every day, to me, is shocking. And that's just alcohol. That's not any other substance coming into play there. Now, something that we all want to deem as, the main problem, people often don't think of, alcohol as the most problematic. They often want to consider drug use or substance use, the opioid epidemic, right? We think of fentanyl, we think of heroin, and those are very problematic. A lot of substance use disorders that I see do come from the quote-unquote hard drugs, such as fentanyl, cocaine, and meth. If I had all the time in the world, I would dive deeply into each one individually, but I don't think anyone wants to hear me speak all day, and I don't blame you. But I do want to really highlight fentanyl and its prevalence, especially here in the South. And honestly, I work in Greenville, North Carolina, and I would say about 5% of our patient population comes from Elizabeth City, Hertford area. We see them almost every day. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is approximately 50% more powerful than morphine. Many studies have shown that almost all substances bought off of the street, such as marijuana or cocaine, are now being cut with fentanyl, which leads to unintentional overdose deaths. In 2024, over 105,000 people died from an opioid-involved overdose, and approximately 217 people die of opioid overdose every single day. Fentanyl is often mixed with other substances in order to create more potent effects. Currently, something we're seeing a lot is a substance called Tranq, which is horse tranquilizer and fentanyl, and it's being smoked, and it's eating people alive. It's eating their bones and their extremities, and they don't reform. So they're walking around in kind of like a zombie effect, with chunks of skin missing, which sounds kind of gross, but it's reality, and it makes them even more susceptible to an early death. Personally, almost all the patients that I work with are polysubstance users. A lot of people do, an upper and a downer. Something I see most commonly is cocaine and alcohol. You want to hype yourself up, but then you want to bring yourself back down when the anxiety or the effects get too much. Other people will tell you they just use whatever they can get their hands on, which is also dangerous. I hear all the time, I don't really have a substance of choice. I just don't want to feel anything, and I need to feel something. So I use whatever I can afford that day. And meth is pretty cheap. Fentanyl is pretty cheap. Things like cocaine and alcohol are a little bit more pricey. Most of the people I see are seeking something. They want something to make them feel like something. And, as Christians, we try to seek, Christ, and we try to seek the Holy Spirit in order to fill that void. People who have substance use disorders, when they first picked up a substance, were probably just attempting to feel something, or they wanted, a fun outlet, and it turned into something that has ruined their lives. So now that I've given you a little bit of an overview, I want to highlight the ways I think our church and our leaderships can help people sustain recovery. You may be familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous and Celebrate Recovery. Have any one of you heard of that? Yeah, they're free programs. You can host them at your church. They can be, on a weeknight. You don't have to do a whole lot other than just be a building, right? So in these programs, they all highlight the use of a higher power and how a higher power can help you sustain recovery. I hear a lot of people who have gone through the 12 steps before who know that they can't remain sober if they don't have their higher power. But a lot of times, something I hear a lot as well is that when they do attempt to go to church or to Bible studies, they're looked down on. They're told you're not welcome here. People don't treat them the same, so they don't go. And it doesn't always completely impact their sobriety, but it does often have an effect on it. We have to do a better part in reducing that stigma. Obviously, when someone walks through your church doors, you don't know their background. You don't know where they came from, if they're living in their car, if they're living on the street. You may be able to inherently judge based on their appearance, or maybe they smell like a substance, I don't know. But we have to do a better job of being open-minded. Informational flyers, hosting events meant to facilitate discussions, and partnering with your local shelters and hospitals are also things that I think are very important. Many people who are in substance use journeys, whether they're sober or not, they need donations, they need food, they need rides, they need clothing. And obviously, not all of us have the means to do that, but chances are we know someone who could. Most importantly, I believe we can be the hands and feet of Jesus to those who struggle with substance use disorders by providing empathy. It's almost just as simple as that. Substance use disorders are exhausting, alienating, and difficult. Many of my patients tell me that being in active substance abuse is like a full-time job. You know, their whole entire being centers around how they can get money in order to get their substance of choice. And the longer they've been in active addiction, the more of that substance that they need. So this can be stealing, this can be selling themselves, you name it, they're trying to do it. And that's exhausting. What we can do is be support. The CDC says that individuals with a support system are 45% more likely to maintain long-term sobriety. To me, that's a statistic that almost makes me emotional. Working in detox, I do see repeat patients quite often. We have patients who will come in about every 10 days. We have patients who will detox, leave on Thursday, and by Monday, they've already tried to check themselves back in. Unfortunately, that's the nature of substance use because it is just such a hard habit to break. And a lot of times when I talk to them, it's because they had nowhere to go. So they went back to the street where substances are so very prevalent. They had no one to support them. You know, their family won't answer the phone anymore. No one would give them money for a bus ticket. No one would take them to their medication appointment. And I understand that people burn bridges. I understand that in substance use, bridges are burned daily. You know, I hear stories all the time. My encouragement to everyone, not just church people, obviously, is to still remain empathetic because, like I said before, no one who has a substance use disorder is choosing this. You know, it's the chemistry in their brain that's telling them that they have to continue to search out this high. And it's difficult, obviously, to want to continue to give second and third and fourth chances, but unfortunately, that's the only way we reach people who need it like this. I am certainly not a minister. I grew up as a minister's daughter, so I was taught to treat people with lots of empathy and respect. And then as I got into this field that's considered a helping field, I have just continued to grow more and more empathetic with the more people that I see and the more, you know, situations that I'm made aware of. On an almost daily basis, I see victims of abuse or human trafficking or anything you can think of that you would not want to go through. Most people who struggle with a substance use are going through that. Many of my patients are long-term homeless people. I had a patient recently who was 67 who had not had a home since he was 12 years old. And he had continued to use and get high and drink because he didn't think he had another option and because he had nowhere else to go. And, you know, my heart just breaks for people like that because he's not alone and he's not the only one. And I just feel as though something we can do is be the support that people may not have in their families. In substance use, obviously, every situation is unique. You know, healing is not linear in anything, but most everyone who has a substance use disorder is in a situation that none of us in this room could ever imagine being in. I hear stories at work. I hear situations from my patients, and they're telling me things that no human being ever should have to go through. And then I have conversations outside of work with church people or with friends who say, well, that's sad, but that doesn't really happen around here. Unfortunately, it does. The South of the United States is one of the most prevalent drug hotspots in all of the country. If I pulled up a map, South Carolina, North Carolina into DC is just fentanyl all over the place. The statistics that I shared are not just for the United States. North Carolina is just as much of a drug hotspot as anywhere you look. My encouragement, like I said, is just to be empathetic and to help when you can. I don't expect anyone in here to, donate millions of dollars or to help every single person you see, but it's inviting people to church or volunteering with Celebrate Recovery or volunteering to be someone's mentor. Just praying with people makes a world of a difference too. Does anyone have any questions for me or any feedback?
I guess I have one, not for you, but for those in the room. How many of us use our church buildings for like an Alcoholics Anonymous or a NA? Because that's a resource we have that doesn't cost us anything.
Right.
Jarvisburg does?
Yeah, Celebrate Recovery.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Compass?
A lot of people in early recovery try to do 90 meetings in 90 days. So it's important that there are so many options of meetings for them to find. It's unrealistic sometimes for people to say, well, I expect them just to immediately be healed, to be fixed, so to speak, but not to provide any of the things they need.
Karlee, what is the typical, and there probably is no typical, the percentage of relapses?
It's about 80%.
Okay.
Just the nature of the way your brain works on a substance. Substances rewire your brain to function most highly in chaos. And so unless you're able to flatten out the way your brain works into functioning best in stability, you're going to go right back to that chaos, which would be that drug-seeking behavior. So relapse happens a lot. Most everyone I see at work has tried sobriety more than a dozen times. Anyone else? Dad?
Tell them the age range, youngest to oldest, that you've dealt with.
Yeah, we have patients born in 2006 right now. And I hear a lot, and I'm not trying to just, pour onto the church, but something that has frustrated me as I've worked in substance use is that, I'm on Facebook, as many of you are, and I go to church. So I see the things that our youth groups are offering, and they're almost all on relationships or on being Jesus while you play sports. And I think that's great and that's needed, but I think we need to start having these difficult conversations with our youth groups before they leave the house to go to college. I have a patient who turned 18 and had no idea that substances were out there. So when they went to college, they didn't know they were bad. They grew up super religious and their parents thought that they were shielding them from everything, but they were shielding them too much. So when they had the freedom and the ability to purchase cocaine, they didn't know it was necessarily the worst thing in the world. I think I see people from the ages of 18, and I think last week I had a man who was 84. It doesn't just pick one population. It doesn't just pick one age group. I'm 27, and I have patients my age and younger all the time. And I just think if we as the church would start having these conversations, start talking to our youth groups about the dangers of drugs and alcohol. I know when I was in high school in rural North Carolina, most of my people in my youth group were buying alcohol from people older than them, and their parents were oblivious to it. Obviously, parents aren't all-knowing. No one expects that, but difficult conversations need to be had.
Years ago, alcoholism was referred to as a family disease because everybody in the family is affected. Are there any ideas that you might think that the church could implement to minister to the family? A lot of times, the hidden disease, nobody will talk about it. It's the secret of the family.
Yeah.
But some programs or things that might be beneficial for families to gain the strength that they can help make a change in how they respond?
Yeah, so Alcoholics Anonymous has a curriculum based on things families of alcoholics should know. So there's lots of curriculums out there, and I'm more than willing to send you links that I know of, but there's lots of curriculum out there that's meant to educate families of people in addiction so that they know more how to respond to it. Is that what you're asking?
What would you say the church has done very good about this issue, and where has it failed on the issue? So where has it succeeded maybe in recent years, and then where has it been failing?
So in recent years, I think it has succeeded in like trying. And I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but I live in Greenville, and most of the organizations that donate or provide rides are secular organizations. There's a lot of churches, and this is just speaking in Greenville, a lot of churches in Greenville who, will share things and will say, oh, we're praying for them, but I'm not seeing a lot of action. And obviously that's subjective to where I live. But I think for all things in churches in general, sometimes we fall into the mindset of, well, I'm praying for that. I'm praying for that. We'll add it to the prayer list, but we don't see any action, not just in this field, but in all sorts of things, And so I think if churches would actually meet with, your local psychiatrists and counselors and therapists and just ask, how can we help, We have a woman who comes in I work in a residential program. So we have someone who comes in on Sundays and provides church. They play songs on the guitar and they pray. And we could have multiple churches doing that,
Think outside the box or whatever that means. Think outside the bun.
And then we see lots of homeless people, which is hard. And when you're homeless, you sell everything you have to be able to eat or to be able to obtain your substance. So when you do try to become sober, you have nothing. So we all the time have people donate clothing or shoes or, books or whatever it is. Because another thing, when people go to get a job, if they're homeless, they have no clothes, that automatically makes getting another job much more difficult, right? If you show up to a job interview in a sweatshirt that you've been sleeping in for the past 2 weeks, it's probably not going to bode well for your chances of getting that job, right? But if we had churches volunteering to, donate used polos or dresses or whatever it is in order to help, increase the likelihood of rehabilitation.
How do we reduce the stigma within our churches of folks who struggle?
I think some of the verbiage that I talked about, obviously, and even still, like all of the people that I work with, we still use, addiction or substance abuse, because sometimes when I say substance use, no one understands what I'm talking about. But thinking about the verbiage, just how you're referring to people. I was at church last week, and someone asked me how my week at work was, and I said it was good, and he said, I just couldn't work with the crackheads all week. And I think we have to get out of that mindset, Sure.
She doesn't worship with me. I want to point that out. She's not going to Church of Christ.
And that's just something that's been so standard in the United States, crackheads, potheads, junkies. We have to get out of that and just, they're humans too, We all struggle with something. They're humans too. A Bible verse that I really like, thanks to my dad, that I think pertains to substance use is Matthew 9:36, which says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And I just think that's an important mindset to have. And that helps reduce the stigma as well. Obviously, the stigma doesn't go away overnight. But with changing the way we talk about it, having discussions, being willing to help or just to pray helps reduce the stigma. Don't know what else to say. If you have any questions, I'm willing to answer.
Is there a lack of Christian counseling and counselors, or are we seeing a good amount, or do we need to push that more? Is there a lack, I guess is my question.
That's a good question. So I work for the state, and most of my coworkers come from a Christian background. So since it's a state facility, we're not, praying with our patients unless they're asking. So I think more people who work in quote unquote secular positions who have the Christian backing are important. I think something that has been frustrating for a lot of us is that there are people who claim to be Christian counselors who are seeing people who are just saying, pray it away. So I think there needs to be the intersection of both. You know, you use your higher power and you use your spirituality to help aid your recovery, but you're understanding that that's not the only piece. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I absolutely think, I mean, mental health is one of the only fields that has like tripled and quadrupled in its need since COVID. There's not enough counselors or therapists in the United States to meet with everyone that has a substance use or mental health diagnosis right now. If you call anyone in your area, I guarantee you they have a weeks-long wait list on when they can get you in. We need people who are willing. If you're feeling like you want to go back to school to get a master's degree, get it in counseling. I mean, I'm so serious.
Mm-hmm. The next level of those stages, and some of the stages go back to square one, some days too.
Right.
But I have found that when people are rooted in faith, they're able to really base a lot of the next chapter of putting it in his hand, knowing that this is all part of life. And I've seen the difference between the two personally with friends of mine that are and aren't. And,
Yeah.
It's as a friend of someone who's going through that, you can ruin relationships and everything just based off of how deep they get into that tunnel of just darkness.
Absolutely.
What's advice to bring them into a better understanding of opening up that door to go through the stages together, but also opening up to get them into the more mindset of becoming a Christian and thinking through that in a different way? I know it's a long-winded way of wording that question. Sorry.
No, I understand what you're asking. So like discipleship and early recovery, is that what you're referring to? I think that that's really hard, but obviously very necessary. I think you just have to have, once again, an empathetic mindset and understand that some of the doors that they've closed in their minds are not going to reopen overnight. Obviously, my desire is for everyone in early recovery to rekindle a relationship with the Lord. But I also understand that a lot of them have gone through such trauma and such grief, like you're speaking on, that it's not going to just immediately go away with sobriety or with going to church, and just to understand that it's not going to be a quick process, and just continue to keep the faith and continue to do what you're doing and hope and pray that one day, it does come to fruition. Because just like recovery, rekindling relationships, especially a relationship with Christ, does not happen quickly for people who have been in this other mindset for so long.
One thing, and I think it pertains a lot to addictions, is the issue of shame.
Say that again?
The issue of shame.
Uh-huh.
Can you address that a little bit? Because sometimes we shame people in the church. So, how, and I'm sure your clients pretty much come in, they are so ashamed
Mm-hmm.
because they have been taught that it's a moral failure, that
Mm-hmm.
it's, all of these things, that they're a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
And if we, re-emphasize that stigma, we're just adding fuel to the fire, and that's a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, low self-esteem and shame and guilt are super common in substance use. I think it ultimately goes back to, how we address them in the open. Seeing people on the corner, begging for money. I don't know if that happens in Elizabeth City, but I see it in Greenville a lot. And just changing your mindset on that has helped a lot of our people reduce the shame. Obviously, like you said, begging for money, begging for substances, being in detox is really shame-inducing. I have a patient right now who has no self-esteem, doesn't think he deserves to be sober. And I think it's just, preaching the verses in the Bible that teach us about, overcoming obstacles, being open-minded, telling them, I understand where you're coming from, just reiterating that this isn't your fault, it's not a moral failing. A lot of things that you're discussing are kind of just like conversations you have one-on-one, and it's kind of like a trickle-down effect. Does that make sense? Because, I mean, you can post about it all day long, or you can make a flyer about it all day long, but until someone actually sees you acting that out and actually has that conversation with you, it's not going to be believed. Does that make sense?
Karlee, following that up, if shame is not an issue, what about when families do ask us our role on tough love? When they have children and they've done all they can, they've been taken advantage of so many, and they come to me and they're just in tears, and that's really, and yet, do I advocate for tough? Is there a time when you encourage families to cut off and all, I balance that between what motivates them to change, but when families are begging, do we practice tough love, and especially as a church minister, how can I call myself a Christian and practice tough love? Do you ever have to deal with families and the ripple effect of that?
Absolutely. And there's tough love and there's enabling, right? And a lot of people struggle to see if I'm bailing them out every time, and am I enabling them? Or if I'm not bailing them out every time, am I hanging them out to dry? I personally don't think there's ever a point where you should completely cut someone off, because, I mean, there may become a time where you don't know if they're alive or not. Obviously, I think it's very subjective and situational. If someone's been in detox 50 times, I understand, maybe the family does say, I want to cut them off. I think that's understandable. But I think you have to remind them that, Jesus never cuts us off. The Bible says God never turns his back on us, right? And so it's important to remember that when we think about how many chances God has given us at Grace and how many times God has bailed us out, right? Obviously, enabling does not help anyone, and I see that a lot. But I think you can love people despite their fallings, and you can love people from a distance without having to completely cut them off.
What practical then from a distance? Because I've had family members who say, I can't let him into a family gathering. I've got grandchildren or nieces or nephews, and he's terrible, or she's a terrible influence. I struggle as a minister trying to say to them, yes, I understand, versus Jesus forgives Jesus.
Sure.
I'm looking for practical. Do I feel okay telling people it's okay to cut them off?
I think it's definitely okay to say you're not welcome at this event. If you've been so drunk you couldn't function at the past 5 Christmases, I think it's totally understandable to say you're not welcome at our family Christmas. However, we can get together and eat lunch together and I'll pray with you. Things like that. Obviously, in a situation, where someone has continuously been a bad influence around grandkids, cousins, what have you, you don't want them, in that situation again. But it doesn't mean you can't see them individually and you can't talk to them on the phone, or you couldn't pray for them or buy them a Christmas meal. Does that make sense?
I just often wonder, do we ever separate the spiritual side from the practical, physical recovery side?
I think that's a decision for everyone personally to make amongst themselves. I personally think, from personal experience and work, the people that I see whose families have cut them off are the worst off.
Really?
Absolutely. Because they have nothing to live for at that point.
So more harm than good is what you're saying.
That would be my opinion. And I know other people would disagree with me. But from my perspective, I have patients all the time who I'll say, who's your support system? And they have absolutely no one they can write down because everyone has cut them off. And so then they have nowhere to go, or they get into a program and then it's like, well, I could be sober, but no one cares if I am. No one's going to look for me. No one supports it. I don't have anyone to help me stay sober. I don't have anyone to stay accountable to. I do think it does more harm than good.
What do you say to the family who says, we've spent all we have, we've done everything we can, we have nothing left materially to give to them? I mean, and we don't want to cut them off from our lives, but what can we continue to do? We can't give them money, we can't give them a place to stay. What can we do?
Well, I think more importantly than material is the prayer and the checking in with them every day and the telling them you're there for them and you're supporting them and you're praying for their recovery and you're proud of their recovery. Most people I see would much rather be told, I love you, I'm proud of you, than here's $50. You know, they want to be appreciated, and they want someone to recognize that they've put in this hard work and that they're doing what they can to remain sober. And obviously in my role as a therapist, you know, I can give them that all day long, but I'm someone that they're going to see for 28 days and then probably never see again. Whereas their family is going to be there forever, and they'd much rather be told, my mom's proud of me, my dad's proud of me, my sister's proud of me, things like that.
Do you try to pull the family in if they're 28 days with you and then the recovery? Do you try to, even if the family's been, do you try to pull them in quickly or no?
So every patient has a right to family sessions, and if they say, I really want my brother to see what I'm doing, we do a lot of family sessions. So like I'll give my perspective on how the patient is doing. The patient will give their perspective and we'll discuss it all together. But if the patient has already been cut off and they can't communicate with them, there's nothing we're able to do at that point.
You don't try to find the family, you don't do it.
That's a HIPAA violation.
There you go. Okay. You get permission?
It's like a lot of tricky red tape. It kind of is subjective, but most of the time it's a HIPAA violation.
Responsibility is to try to reconnect.
Yeah.
Because I've often wondered, what do I tell families when I hear that their children are in there? Should I encourage them as a parent? You know? But again, only when asked. I can't insert myself as their
Right.
parent.
Right.
And they'll react.
Right.
And I struggle as a teacher.
Absolutely.
How they've been abused, how they've been taken advantage of, how, you know, but yet sympathetic to the individuals out there.
And I think it's, like you're saying, important to be empathetic to both sides, because chances are the family has been put through a whole lot as well. And I think, you know, finding that fine line in the middle of reconciliation is very hard.
Karlee Landry, that's how I sit down and stop my promise.
No, you're fine.
Are there any legal aspects of the church when you know, and I guess I'm asking separation, I don't know, are we ever gonna find ourselves in trouble telling parents not to try to engage or to engage and it's got to be something happen, you know, and that reconciliation, I don't know.
I don't, as far as I know, no. I mean, if someone overdoses and dies, the person at fault would be the person who sold them the drugs.
In your program, if you're in your program and still do something to themselves harm, y'all are not responsible for that either, even if they were under your care or anything,
Well, we're in a locked facility, so they really can't do anything to harm themselves.
so it's not the outpatient thing.
Right. I work inpatient, yes, sir. But as far as red tape on like your end, there would be none.
I just asked, I don't know whether we're okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Does the church have any legal, or if someone comes to my, and they're having an issue with illegal drugs and stuff, is this kind of like patient confidentiality? He's not legally, or they're selling, or, you know, they're breaking the law. Is the church legally mandated to report them, or?
So the only legal thing, the only mandated things you would have to tell are abuse of someone under the age of 18. Yeah.
Any kind of abuse?
Any kind of abuse.
And again, is that a simple phone call to the sheriff's office, or
Say that again?
is that just a simple phone call to the sheriff's office, or?
You would call your local sheriff's office and they would be able to direct you. It differs by county.
Karlee, thank you for doing the hard work. I wanted Karlee so much to come to MACU years ago, and God had different plans for her. And I have loved and supported this girl through the years.
Thank you.
And just am so thankful for what she's doing and making a difference. So thank you for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you.
today.
Thank you for having me.